Hey everyone, this is the VSM Real Estate Podcast, getting you closer to massively successful players in the Twin Cities real estate market. This is your host, Andre Anderson, along with the man himself, Ryan Schroeder.
Thank you, Andre.
Before we get into it today, we did have a couple of announcements. One, we spent a lot of time, energy, and actually some money to reinvest in our website. That will be coming out in about a week or two, so stay tuned and keep looking at it. I also heard that you have maybe a speaking engagement pretty soon here.
Yeah, actually, thank you for bringing that up. May 15th, we're doing a seminar here at our building, actually. It's an investor workshop where we're going to be helping new investors learn the basics of buy, fix, rent, and buy, fix, flip, and offering our services to assist them within it as well.
Nice. I'm definitely going to be there. Hope you all can join. So today's guest, they say hustle until you don't need an introduction. I feel like our guest today doesn't need an introduction, but I will introduce him anyways. This is Jeff Peterson, often referred to as Professor 1031. He was on our podcast already once, and it was actually the most popular podcast we had. And I was actually I think I probably listened to it about 2 or 3 times. And just found it super informational. I've probably taken about 2 or 3 education courses and, heard you speak, and every time I feel like I'm writing a novel. So today, we also will welcome you to the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about 1031.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Ryan, for having me in today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's always great to have you. I don't know if you remember, I think you and I met about 2004-ish or so. You were doing a class in I want to say like a country club or something out in Eden Prairie or Minnetonka, somewhere on the west side when I was in the hotel business. And I still remember thinking, why is this guy so nice to me? Everybody else treated me like dirt because I was so young and inexperienced looking, but you're like the only guy who was, I guess, maybe saw something in me and was nice to me. So I appreciate that.
Well, I will tell you, I think I did probably see something in you, and I think very highly of you and what you've accomplished here with VSM and all of the different real estate experiences that you've had. I think that you are one of the rock stars in the industry, so keep an eye on you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So Jeff, as Andre alluded to, is the preeminent 1031 guy. So I would even go so far as to say I call you with just about any complicated real estate tax-related question. You seem to be well-versed in all of it. But do you want to give everybody just a quick bio on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I think one thing that distinguishes me from a lot of people in this industry is that I'm an attorney. I am a tax professor at Mitchell Hamlin, and I run my own business. And I like to think that I kind of eat what I kill, and that I need to be out there promoting our services, teaching people about how to do tax deferral, and singing the praises of 1031s from the mountaintops at every juncture. And I've kind of gotten to the point where people will call me up and say, Jeff, I've heard about you from like 2 or 3 different people, my real estate agent, my banker, my attorney, my priest, my rabbi. Mm-hmm. They all told me to call you right away. And that's really fulfilling for me when I've kind of gotten myself out there that much.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I mentioned that we were having a podcast with you as the guest yesterday at a networking event, and everybody there knew who you were, and one of them was like, oh, that's the guy with the same little business journal ad every month or whatever, and I remember I had just seen you in it, and so you're very well known. That's good.
Thank you.
Sure.
So on our last podcast, I think we just kind of went through some general guidelines and kind of explained 1031. We might go a little deeper this time, but I guess we could just kind of revamp on what 1031 is, just some basic definitions and for new listeners.
I think most people know the basics. If you wanted to kind of recap some of that, but aren't there a lot of other really new, interesting tax stuff that you're dabbling in too?
Absolutely. So why don't we just do a little bit of the nuts and bolts? But we do have some really good practice tips, pro tips, that we can kind of pepper in here as well.
For sure.
In this super hot market that we're in right now, I mean, it's a blessing. Stuff is selling in 10 hours. It is a crazy market. But that can also create some difficulties when you're trying to figure out how to maneuver inside of the deadlines for a 1031 exchange. So when you sell your old relinquished property and you go to that closing, that's day zero for computing your 45-day identification period and your 180-day replacement property sort of in exchange deadline. Well, in this hot seller's market, if you're not thinking ahead like a chess player, 45 days can go by really fast. And it can be like musical chairs, where you're hearing the music stop and you don't have a replacement property to go sit on. So, Ryan, what do you guys do to try to mitigate that risk that you're going to get caught without anything to go into?
I think it comes down to planning, number one. If you can have some degree of understanding of what it is you're going to be looking at next. I know that there's reverse 1031 exchanges and there's some other creative alternatives as well in there, but I'd feel more comfortable if you explained them.
Well, I know from the past that you guys like to lock up replacement properties with a purchase agreement, and it's a lot easier to move forward with a 1031 if you've fallen in love with your next acquisition.
Sure it.
So locking up that replacement property so you know you've got a sure thing to exchange into, and more specifically to designate as your official replacement property within that 45-day time frame. But sometimes you got that property in your sights and you start to do the due diligence and you find out, hey, this isn't actually everything I thought it was going to be, but you may not discover that until day 40. And now you've got a very short time frame to substitute in a new ideal replacement property. So a lot of people are locking up properties early, trying to get their due diligence done, but also maybe working on Plan B, the backup identified property, just in case.
Sure.
I think working with an outfit like yours, you have a lot of properties and a big window on the world, and you have a nice vantage point to see lots of potential replacement properties, and you can filter those to a specific client's needs and risk tolerance and sort of experience level.
Yeah.
When you're doing a 1031, you want to buy a replacement property of equal or greater value than what you sold.
Yep.
But that doesn't really tell you the whole thing, because value is probably the gross sales price minus transactional costs like the commissions, the title company charges, recording fees. So you really want to exchange into something equivalent or greater than your net sales price.
Okay.
But if you think about it, you want to continue your investment. And why not lever up into a little bit bigger, better property? A lot of tax problems can get solved by buying a bigger, better property, but as a capitalist, why wouldn't you want to buy up?
Right.
Are interest rates super duper low? Are banks, aggressively pricing and approving loans right now? It's not like during the Great Recession when the money dried up and nobody had an appetite for doing deals. Everyone seems to be able to get their financing approved one way or another. So I don't know from a business perspective why you wouldn't go up in value.
Unless maybe, certain personal situations where if you're nearing the end of your working years, or you're looking for something a little bit more stable or something closer to home or easier to manage. But generally speaking, I would agree with you. I mean, most people who do 1031 exchanges are firmly within the growth mode of their careers. So
Now, I can say this because I am a grumpy old man, but I occasionally will get clients who are grumpy and typically old men, and they just want to put the blinders on and only reinvest their equity, their net proceeds, into a all-cash deal. And they don't want to necessarily get back on the debt treadmill and lever into the next replacement property. But if you're paying off debt on the old property, you got to replace that debt with either new debt or more cash in to get to a property of equivalent or greater value. What are some ways that we can get that grumpy goat to do what he needs to do or she needs to do to buy an equivalent amount of replacement property, but if they're really adverse to taking on the risks associated with debt, what can we do to mitigate that or help them? Sometimes we'll see non-recourse debt on deals where the bank could get comfortable with it.
Okay.
If the client's got a lot of skin in the game and the replacement property is super steady, super stable, strong lease, strong income, we can get the client comfortable with taking out that debt, but on a non-recourse basis so they're not personally liable.
But if it wasn't the personal guarantee necessarily, but just the debt in general that had them concerned, are there alternatives for them? I mean, other than just putting in cash for the difference?
Well, putting in cash is king.
Yeah.
You know,
sure.
that'll get you there. The other option is to do a partial 1031 exchange and to bite the bullet and to pay taxes dollar for dollar to the extent that you buy down in value. And this is an area that a lot of people don't really understand, so I'm just going to jump into it.
Please do.
In a partial exchange, you want to drill down on what is my client's current adjusted basis in the property that they're selling. Basis is kind of like an accounting yardstick to measure how much you've got into a property. Once you know what their current basis is, one way to think about this is, in order to get tax deferral, the replacement property will have to be at least as valuable as their basis was in the old property. At a minimum, in order to get tax deferral, we at least have to replace our basis. And for every dollar over and above the basis, that's a dollar that we're going to be deferring taxes on. So with the grumpy old goat scenario, if the client's got super low basis and wants to do a partial 1031 exchange, we can still fashion a really nice partial victory because their basis is so low. We can still garner great amounts of tax deferral and still have them buy down in value.
Interesting.
So, nuts and bolts. We want to go up or equal in value. We want to go up or equal in equity. So we want to reinvest our proceeds, and we want to offset that debt relief with either new debt or more cash in out of our pockets. And we have to exchange into real estate that's held for investment or business purposes. A lot of people want to play that game where I'm going to be moving into this replacement property. And I think that's antithetical, exactly opposite to holding for investment or business purposes. And I'm not afraid to tell people, I don't think that works. And I know if you get audited, the IRS and the departments of revenue for the various states probably not going to buy that. It's an investment. If your driver's license, your voter registration, your swing set and barbecue are all in that property.
So in this hypothetical scenario, let's say somebody says, I'm going to get cute with it and I want to buy a condo down in Naples, Florida, and I'm going to Airbnb it for a couple of years and then move down there when I retire. Is there a period of time where you're absolved of your sins on your 1031 exchange?
There is a safe harbor that will, if not give you absolution, will give you some certainty that the IRS will respect that property is held for a qualifying purpose of investment or business. Under that safe harbor, the IRS wants to test each of the 2 years after you acquire that property that's in a rental pool to determine if your personal use of the property is more than 14 days a year or more than 10% of the time that the condo is actually rented out.
Used,
And you want to look at each of the 2 calendar years after your exchange. That's a blessing, if you ask me, because
no doubt.
Pretty easy test.
Let's just not be cute for 2 years, and after that, we're wide open. So I love the 1031s into tax-friendly and sunny states like Florida and Texas. For really wealthy taxpayers, you don't necessarily want to die with a lot of real estate in a state like Minnesota that has inheritance tax, because that portion of your estate is going to be subjected to the Minnesota tax. So we see a lot of folks that are getting up there in years that are really thinking about moving their wealth to these more tax-friendly jurisdictions.
That kind of also brings up a point I was always having on my mind. And I understand that you can't really 1031 exchange into property internationally, but I was kind of wondering about U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern, I think Mariana, all these different places. They're pretty, like Pacific, sunny, Caribbean.
Virgin Islands.
Yeah. I mean, does 1031 exchange, and if somebody is kind of planning on, having being all business for that first 2 years and then kind of going after it after, does that work?
There is a bill in the House of Representatives right now to expand the definition of United States as it's defined in the tax code to include Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's had a tough run with the hurricanes and just bad economic growth. And so I would bet that Congress may expand the definition to include Puerto Rico. There has always been, well, not always, but for quite a long time, a private letter ruling that authorized the exchange by a taxpayer into the U.S. Virgin Islands. But the standard in that private letter ruling was not the same old held for investment or use in a trade or business. The standard was income producing. So there has been some ways to do it into the U.S. Virgin Islands, but you actually had to produce income. Well, that's not that hard to do. You rent it out, produce the income.
Interesting.
That's very interesting.
And I've done exchanges into the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I've done some fancy construction exchanges where people are building these huge rental homes right on the ocean, and I could not afford to stay in them, but they look pretty nice.
Not bad.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I love to hear scheme these little loopholes,
Right, for sure.
Well, why does Congress even create these loopholes? It's because they know that 1031 is an organic mechanism. It's pure capitalism to move capital to the most advantageous investment. And when capital flows rapidly inside of your little microcosm, you create growth, you produce jobs, you enhance values. Everybody benefits when capital can move through the system. Think about it as the lifeblood of an economy. And that's why we have it. That's why the code that we have, the United States Internal Revenue Code, is so fat. It's thicker than a phone book because there's so many little nuances and enhancements. And if you think about the complexity of a McLaren or a Lamborghini, why is that vehicle so complex? Because it's built for speed. It's built to go fast, and that's why our tax code and our tax system is so complex. It's built to do a lot of different things, from social engineering, encouraging certain behaviors, discouraging other behaviors, but most importantly, we want to create jobs, and we want to increase values and enhance the velocity of capital. It's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt that as well, that the U.S. tax code is geared towards investment in real estate and investment in businesses. I mean, if you look at the majority of the benefits and the loopholes there for those two people who fit one or both of those descriptions. And so someone like myself who's a business owner and a real estate owner, I've not really often complained about the tax code because I know it's really working in my favor as compared to if I made the same amount of money that I do now, but as a W-2 employee. I mean, the difference would be outrageous in terms of how much more taxes I'd pay. So
I'd love to have you come and talk to my law students at Mitchell-Hamlin, because you are the poster child for a guy that can really conform his behavior to the advantages in the tax code for real estate professionals. And your prospective customers that are coming to you for training on how to fix, flip, or fix and hold, those folks need to know the tax advantages of being an entrepreneur and investing in real estate are tremendous. If you want to build wealth, without the drag of taxation. Find me something better than real estate. If you want a place to keep your wealth, find me a place that's better than real estate. I mean, you've got leverage, you've got enhanced tax treatment, you've got tax-free disposition, and
you've got security of your income through contracts as well. I mean, even at my business, I don't have the same security as I do in my real estate investments. And yes, I would be flattered to, be a part of anything you'd ask me to be a part of with that. And I always like to tell people I've paid a total of $2,000 in federal income taxes in the last 8 years. So it's been tough, but I found a way to power through. So
thank you for doing your patriotic duty.
I always tell people when they get butthurt about that, because a lot of people are like salty about how little I pay in taxes, and they see that I'm doing well and everything. I remind them of a few things. One, I pay a lot more property taxes than they do, okay? Two, I create jobs for people in which I pay payroll taxes and FICA and all the other kind of stuff, and they pay taxes and things like that. And I take things that are shit and I improve them for the benefit of the communities that I'm involved in. So not necessarily doing my patriotic duty by paying taxes, but I'm doing a lot of other stuff for this country, so as far as I'm concerned.
Do you take risks?
I do.
When you buy these properties?
I do.
I mean, if you fall down, is anyone going to pick you up?
Nope.
All right. So there is built into the tax code an incentive to go out there and do your own thing, to build wealth through business ownership. And you may not get a W-2 wage, but you have the upside of making a disproportionately higher amount of money.
Right.
But you also have the underlying risks. You may not make anything.
Right.
You may lose yourself.
Yep.
Let's talk about the new Opportunity Zone legislation that was passed as part of the tax reform. And just sort of as a backdrop, Congress, bipartisan members of Congress, want to focus capital on areas in the economy that are not doing well. And the way they did this is they have these old census tract information, and each of the governors of the states were allowed to designate certain census tracts in their state to be qualified as opportunity zones. And investors are going to be encouraged to either buy businesses, buy real estate, or buy equipment in these opportunity zones. The idea is let's put the capital to work in these areas that have been lagging behind.
Yep.
What are the incentives for qualified opportunity zones?
There's a tax-free gain component on it, so that's the big one.
That's the
and you
kicker.
can 1031 into them as well.
Well, it's not necessarily a 1031, but it is a tax deferral.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that I sell a widget, a gizmo, and I make a $500,000 profit or gain on that sale. I only have to reinvest my profit or gain, not all of my proceeds, just the profit, into this qualified opportunity fund. I get tax deferral until 2026, December 31st of 2026. I am going to defer my gains on that profit. And if I hold my investment in the Qualified Opportunity Fund for 5 years, they forgive 10% of that deferred gain. If I hold it for another 2 years, so I've got 7 years, they forgive another 5%. Now that all has to have been accrued by December 31st, 2026. So the window to do these Qualified Opportunity Zone investments is perishable. Mm-hmm. And by the end of 2019, that's the best deal.
Yeah, you can lose part of it.
Right.
The 5% after.
So I think we're going to see a lot of potential hustling and velocity at the end of the year. There's going to be a lot of drama where people are trying to get Qualified Opportunity Zone deals done within the sweetest window. But as you mentioned, Ryan, the kicker, the thing that makes these things awesome, is that if you invest into this fund, the fund buys something or develops something in that opportunity zone, and that something takes off like a rocket and appreciates tremendously in value, you sell that property before 2047, and your basis in that something gets stepped up to the fair market value when you sell that something.
Wow.
Okay, so what if you and I started a new internet
That's
business?
That's always the fantasy with this, too, because I know you were on the panel with Brad and talking about the qualified opportunity zones, and I've been to a couple of things. The idea of having a tech startup in your qualified opportunity zone where you have the real estate and the business, and then, hope it's the next Instagram or whatever it may be, and sell it for billions of dollars and having the whole gain be tax-free. I mean, what could be better than that?
Yeah.
So who's going to invest money into the qualified opportunity zones? I think it's going to be Wall Street money, the stocks, the bonds, the people that, have a lot of Amazon or Apple stock and have a lot of gains. They're locked into those investments unless they have a tool to defer the gains. Well, the rest of us that do real estate deals, we've always had a tool. It's called 1031. We can defer,
Die.
So why not do the 1031 on your real estate, but for the more conventional entrepreneurs that are selling their business and cashing out or selling their stocks or bonds, they don't have that mechanism. And I think that's where the real money source is going to come for any success that there is with opportunity zones.
My only sort of fear, if you will, with the opportunity zone thing is that was part of a tax reform under the current administration. It's not a guarantee that the next president would necessarily, assuming Trump doesn't get reelected, would necessarily, respect and keep that, right? Isn't there some risk that could be kind of taken away just as easily as it was put in place?
At the time that we're taping this, I'm not even sure if Minnesota is going to conform to the federal statute. So there's uncertainty. And the problem with this opportunity zone thing is it is complicated. The guidance and regulations has been sent out in dribs and drabs slowly. The government shutdown didn't help things.
Yeah.
And it is hard for the connective tissue between Wall Street money and Main Street real estate to get created this quickly.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that. And I just feel like, 1031 is so much easier to understand, so much easier to implement. For normal real estate investors, the opportunity zone is kind of a distraction, not a real viable option.
Yeah, that's how I would describe it for me too. I find it very intriguing, but I haven't been able to even really fathom how to apply it at this point. And I always try and kind of be somewhere on that continuum of not being the first adopter, but still trying to be kind of an earlier adopter when new things come out, so I can still have some meat left on the bone. You don't want to be the last one to the party or anything like that, but I like to see a couple other people pioneer it through and try and, because I don't know if you remember a few years ago when I was trying to use the 506c legislation and the crowdfunding and stuff like that, and I kind of learned a little lesson there, which was, let some smarter people on the coast test and figure it out with their deep pockets and things, and then learn from them. And
Sure. Yeah.
So
Kind of like Apple Computer. Their technology may not be the newest, but they certainly package it in a way that is very successful.
yeah. What else is new in the tax world? I mean, is opportunity zone like the big thing? Is there
That's a big one, but I got to tell you, bonus depreciation.
Let's talk about that.
It's just awesome. So in the olden days, pre-tax reform, when you bought used equipment, you were limited on how much depreciation you could take on it. But with the tax reform, you can get bonus depreciation on new and used equipment that you put into service. Well, what if we buy a warehouse together, and that warehouse is comprised of big chillers, cooling units that keep produce and other stored goods at a right temperature?
Yep.
Well, the building is real estate. The land is $12.50 undepreciable.
Yeah.
But if we do a cost segregation study and we go in and say, all right, the land is worth X, the building and structure is worth Y, and the internal components that we can parse out as short-lived personal property, basically, that component, the chiller, the coolers, and so forth, we can bonus that in the first year. The tax deduction we get from the bonus depreciation may exceed our down payment, which means you're in for nothing.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Bonus depreciation is like the awesome tool that no one is thinking about. Everyone talks about opportunity zones. I want to talk about bonus depreciation. Can you find me that warehouse with the chillers in it? Let's go do a couple of those deals.
Yeah. I like the idea of the bonus depreciation, too, because someone who's in the position that I'm in, I'm always conflicted when I'm putting money into one of my rental properties. If I want to depreciate that as personal property over 5 years, and I have to pay for the whole thing right now, but I only get the benefit 20% a year for the next 5 years, or if I want to expense it using like a Section 179 or something like that. But then when you expense it, then it counts against your net operating income. And when you were to do, let's say, an appraisal on this property, and they look through your financials and they're going to apply a cap rate, well, a depreciation can get added back, but an expense does not. And it's the same way that banks look at it for financing. So I would like to find a way to kind of utilize that tool to get sort of the benefit of expensing it, but then also the add back capability of a depreciation. So I agree with you. I think that's a sneaky little nugget there that people aren't paying enough attention to.
I love it. And now you are a real estate professional, so you have almost uncapped abilities to take these passive, non-cash losses and offset your high earned income that you have from commissions and
flips
and dealing. So, you are in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
So investors that are looking at getting into the fix and flip, fix and hold, they need to be thinking about, how can I have this side hustle amount to enough time in the industry so that I can be considered a real estate professional? And if they're married and they've got a stay-at-home spouse, maybe the stay-at-home spouse can accumulate the hours, manage the properties, and be the real estate professional, but together they file a joint tax return, and now they've just opened up Pandora's box of depreciation deductions, and they can take as much as they need.
I always tell people that same thing, that if one spouse is a high W-2 wage earner, the other needs to be a real estate professional. I mean, that's the best way to not pay taxes.
Your first job is to learn how to make a lot of money. Your second job is to manage your adjusted gross income, to keep as much of that hard-earned income working for you. It's not how much you make, it's how much you
keep.
Right.
Yeah.
So between the two spouses, you can really get that.
No doubt.
I think you and I could probably nerd out on taxes for longer than the average listener may be willing to partake, but
we'll cut this podcast into several small bite-sized segments.
Yeah, so you also had some tips for people with replacement loan costs, correct?
Absolutely. When you're doing a 1031, you've got all of this money that's dedicated for one single purpose, and that is to buy real estate. People don't remember that the IRS looks at the monies paid for this mortgage, your financing mechanism. The IRS looks at that mortgage as a separate and distinct asset. You write off the cost of the loan over the life of the loan, and the loan is almost like its own separate thing for tax purposes. So how do you pay for your loan fees if your proceeds from your 1031 are earmarked only for the real estate and not for the mortgage? A lot of people that do real estate deals are real estate rich and they're cash poor. So one tip that people can use is go find a lender that'll give you a no-cost loan. No origination fees, no underwriting fees, but there's a higher interest rate. So that's one way to work around that. And another tip is you can go to the seller of the replacement property and say, seller, I'm giving you your full price asking price. but I do need a concession. I need you to pay up to $5,000 of my closing costs and prepaid expenses on the closing statement. And then earmark the money that you get from the seller in that concession and use that money to pay your lender-related fees that are not kosher to pay with your 1031 proceeds, and try to work it that way.
Interesting.
That's very interesting.
I'll tell you, in the area of fixing and selling, you may have a rental property that has appreciated tremendously in value. Maybe you bought it for $26,000 and now it's worth $176,000, but you got to go out and put new linoleum, new paint, maybe some new appliances. In order to get it shiny and bright, you got to go and use your Visa credit card. And now you go to the closing of the relinquished property and you want to put your Visa bill on the closing statement. You think, well, mentally, this money was spent to put the lipstick on the property. Of course I should be able to reimburse myself, but that Visa bill, that credit card charge, is not tied to the property. The debt doesn't correlate. Like, they're not going to cancel your Visa card if you don't use sales proceeds from this real estate deal. But with a mortgage, the debt is tied to the property. You can't convey marketable title to the buyer unless you get that mortgage released. That lien is tied to the property. So if you're going to use money to beautify the property, either you've got to go get a line of credit or mortgage against your relinquished property so the debt is tied to it, or you're going to have to front that cash out of your own pocket, not reimbursing yourself when the property gets sold, and making sure that you're moving all of your net proceeds, all of your equity, into the new replacement property. Now, let's say you have completed that acquisition, and you feel like you're a little bit tight for money because you had to put all that cash into the property. What do?
Probably do a second mortgage or line of credit against the equity that's in the new property, and you can kind of draw it out then.
You got it, but you have to delay your gratification in reimbursing yourself until a second subsequent closing can be structured to grab your excess equity out of the replacement property. But taking out cash during the exchange would be devastating. That'd be the most expensive money you could get your hands on. 25% recapture. State of Minnesota is almost another 10%. And then there might even be NITA tax, net investment income tax. So you're much better off doing what Ryan says, wait until the end of the deal, in a second subsequent closing, go grab some of your equity out later.
Yeah. Interesting. So when you're doing a flip like I do, that's one of the things that I do, there's no option for doing a 1031 exchange or any of these kinds of things. Do you ever have tips for people who really have no choice but to face the music on that, or is it really just...
Well, you could do an opportunity zone play.
Okay.
You can't do 1031 because it's inventory. It's held for investment. If it's not held for investment or business, and holding primarily for resale,
there's really no tax advantages to the flip business that I've been able to find. I was just curious if there were any nuggets I wasn't aware of.
I think there's some structural opportunities in how you create your business and how you form it. And the way that you own real estate long term may be different than the way that you set up your corporate documents for owning a fix and flip operation. And you almost might want to have separate silos and separate sets of books, separate entities.
I do have separate entities, and I have actually conceived of there might be a better way of doing it by structuring it either as an S Corp, an LLC tax as an S Corp, or even potentially even a C Corp. But has anybody really done the numbers yet, by the way, on the new tax code to see? Because when I looked at what the C Corp tax structure was, and I compared it to the S Corp with the 20% pass-through, I just kind of eyeballed it, and I thought right around $500,000 a year in net operating income is where the C Corp might start to make sense, where you pay tax on a corporate level, but then on a personal level, it's taxed as a dividend.
It's really hard because you don't know what level of velocity you're going to have. The flipping business is kind of counter-cyclical in that when the economy is down, you maybe have more inventory to grab and flip. Whereas when the economy is really high, you have to compete harder for those properties, and it's maybe less
lower
easy to do.
Yeah.
Right. So it's hard to know it's hard to forecast which entity type is best for you. Maybe you set them both up. Have two different silos for flipping and one silo for your buy and hold.
The buy and hold stuff is all kind of locked in already, and those are LLCs because that seems to be the preferred way of holding it, and they never really show a gain for tax purposes because of the depreciation anyways. But then we do S corps for our, the commission side of the business and everything. So I believe you've done an S corp too, haven't you, Andre?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome.
I know enough to at least tell some of the people around me what I would do.
You bet.
Hopefully I'm not just making mistakes left and right with my advice. But don't sue me.
Well, having a good accountant, having a good lender, banker, having a good lawyer, assembling your team is kind of important because nobody can know everything there is to know about everything. So you need to rely on your resources.
True. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Very true. Very true. Yeah. Are there any other changes with like the tax reform and specifically to 1031?
Well, the economic news is out that the first quarter of this year, the economy was growing at over 3% GDP, annualized GDP. The economy is hot. Mm-hmm. My phone has been ringing off the hook. My business is good, and I think from talking to other entrepreneurs, everyone is feeling pretty confident right now. And there had been sort of a feeling towards the end of last year. It was a little bit of a pessimistic wet blanket feeling like the recession's coming. It's just a matter of time. It's going to happen. I don't feel that anymore. And I'm talking to people who are not feeling it either. And there's a feeling like, look, presidential elections are just around the corner. They're not going to let the economy tank during that period of time because it would affect the outcome of the election. And there's enough momentum in this tank that it's going to carry us even well beyond the presidential election. So am I optimistic? I'd say, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic that things are going to continue to be blossoming and expanding and growing, at least for the next 36 months. So what does that mean? I think there's a lot of money that's been sitting on the sidelines waiting for someone to figure out what to do with it because they haven't been certain enough about where they're going to go. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see some of that cash coming off the sidelines and coming back into real estate, and I think it's going to be in areas of real estate that haven't maybe peaked yet. Mm-hmm. Multifamily is either peaked or is getting close to the peak, but other segments like industrial, student housing, senior housing, medical office, and even some ag-related land business deals, I think are going to be areas where people are going to be looking to get that bounce because they maybe haven't appreciated yet. Also, I'm seeing outer, what we'd call the tertiary markets. Those are getting interesting, and people are having to buy further out to find those little gems where they can still get the good values. When you buy further out, you may not get as much appreciation, but if you're getting the cash-on-cash return, maybe you can live with not as much potential appreciation. Mm-hmm. So people are looking outside of the metro areas to find those cool bargains.
Nice. Yeah, I think last time you had mentioned that you had actually a lot of clients from Texas and California. Are you seeing any shifts, on your client base, kind of as you were speaking before, getting to more tertiary markets and?
Well, they consider us a tertiary market.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they come over to Minneapolis and they see a diverse economy, pretty good statistics, and if you try to buy an apartment building in Boston, forget about it. You're not going to make any appreciation for 7 years because you have to overpay for that property. Come to Minneapolis, you can still get a pretty good bargain. And I think we're going to see more and more of the coast money moving into places like Minneapolis. Now, we may not have that same story in Mankato or Duluth, but you might see it in Rochester. And I think that you're going to see outside money coming into the Twin Cities and pushing up prices. And that means that we're going to have to be more creative to find our replacement solutions.
Exactly.
I've noticed that the people who are in the multifamily side of it specifically, that if they're from this area, they feel like it's already kind of dried up, and now our multifamily buyers are looking in Tennessee and Texas and Ohio and other, if Minnesota is a tertiary market, I don't know what the fourthiary term is, but those are even lower on the totem pole in terms of population density and all the little economic factors and things of that nature. And so I'm actually working with buyers right now trying to source deals out of state in those areas that are from here. So it's kind of the pecking order a little bit, I guess.
Well, I want to turn the tables on you guys now, and I want to interview you about something that I've been hearing a lot about and seeing a lot about, and that is Airbnb. What's going on with holding properties and not blocking them into a long-term lease?
Yeah, for sure. So I can't really speak to maybe having commercial loans, but I do run an Airbnb business, and the revenues is much better than long-term tenants. However, it's of course more expensive to hold. I'm kind of doing a little bit of arbitrage and having it on a personal loan that is 30 years locked, really low interest rates, 4-5%, right around there, and it's a sweet deal, definitely.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's a very management-intensive type of play. But in Andre's situation specifically, he has a couple of duplexes in close proximity to one another, and he can manage that a little bit easier. I could see if you had them 30 minutes apart or 20 minutes from where you live, that it might make it more prohibitive because of the cost of getting them cleaned every day and, trying to kind of roll out the red carpet for people. But there's no doubt about it, your gross rent potential is astronomically higher than in a fixed rate, or in a fixed lease, I should say.
Well, in this gig economy, and people are using Airbnb all the time. I don't know how the hotels are going to stay in business, but I think that's a huge opportunity for people to redeploy their money into assets that are really Airbnb-able, if that's a verb. I've got a guy that's been exchanging out of northern Minnesota into fancy parts of Florida, brand new stuff on a golf course where a golf membership comes with it. And people Airbnb his stuff all day long. And he bends over backwards to make sure that his guests have a good experience. Like, he had a couple from Canada come down, and they were upset that there wasn't a potato masher in the unit. Well, he doesn't want any bad reviews.
For sure.
So he runs out to the dollar store and gets a potato masher and brings it over to the place so that these folks would write him a good review, and sure enough, they did. But you've got to kind of really be on it.
That's some serious concierge-level service required, I feel like, at Airbnb, because they know that the reviews sway a lot of power, just like in an Uber or any of those other, sharing type of services. I mean, if you get a bad rap, you're might as well be out of the business. So.
But if you have a happy client, particularly at like these Florida destinations, they'll come back year in, year out at the same week every year. They'll come back and repeat. So it can be really valuable to make that client have a good experience.
True, yeah. I always have repeat guests myself, and of course get great reviews. And I think it's actually kind of the antithesis to a lot of long-term rentals. And I think it's quite nice too, because there's a level of standards that's inherent in that service, whereas there's slumlords around that you see. Of course, our model is way different, and the quality begets quality. But there's that constant feedback loop that's always happening with Airbnb model because of the short term.
It's more of a hotel expectation. Less variability than in your standard single family rental, where one person's definition of clean or painted or normal wear and tear can vary quite a bit.
Dramatically.
But I believe in the Airbnb business, the standard is, the trash cans are emptied and the toilets have been cleaned every time. And, I guess I refer to it as hotel clean. So
Yeah.
Super clean.
Yeah. Super clean. That was a fun little softball. What else you got?
That's what I got. I'm super stoked to be out here and to see you guys, and I just want to encourage everybody to check out my website, which is CPEC 1031, which stands for Commercial Partners Exchange Company. And we have 50-plus five-star reviews on Google. We're AAA rated by the Better Business Bureau. And like I said, we are just super stoked to be in a vibrant, fun economy and to be able to be of service to people and to be able to put a smile on our clients' face by saving them tons of money in taxes. It's just a great business to be in. And one of the things I really like is the opportunity to meet other interesting, cool guys in the business. And so, Ryan, Andre, thank you so much for having me in today.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, there you have it, everyone. Thank you so much for listening.